Our next fictional element is character. And this one can be really fun. I definitely, so you might have to bear with me within this PowerPoint, because sometimes to describe characters and really the importance of having almost like a three-dimensional character, you have to look at it from the writer's perspective. So if any of y'all are creative writers or you have dabbled in creative writing before, specifically, fictional storytelling, you might know a little bit more of what I'm about to talk about. But I always love to begin this discussion with this image that is in our ebook as well. And it's appropriately titled Dickens' Dream. So obviously, we all at least have heard of Charles Dickens, right? Whether we've actually read his very long works in the past or not, um, arguably, his name as an author has been canonized for a reason, right? So in this painting, and I'm forgetting the name of the painter right now. But we see Dickens, sitting in his chair in front of his, it seems to be some type of desk, right? So he's having a little bit of a rest, if you will. And while he's resting his eyes, or as we all know it to be taking a nap, you're seeing his characters, right? Some of them are fully fleshed out, they're in color. I can't point to specific stories right now. It's a little small, and I really don't know Dickens as maybe well as I should. But some of these are in color. They've already been written in the past. He knows who these characters are, right? But then all of these over here, these are the characters that he's still working on, whether it's, maybe the story that he's currently writing at the desk, or it's a character that he maybe had a dream about or had a thought about, in the past. And I love this painting because it's showcasing that even when a writer isn't explicitly writing, they're dreaming, they're reading, they're at the grocery store, right? Like driving. Ooh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Let me go back. They're driving to their next destination, right? Their characters are usually still in their head, kind of like figuring themselves out. And so by the next time they go to sit down at their desk and, work on whatever next scene or moment, the character is already there, And again, if you are not a creative writer, what I just said might make no sense. You might be like, Miss Pickett, respectfully, that sounds like you're talking to yourself. And to that, I answer, I am, I literally am talking to myself right now, recording this PowerPoint. Um, but it's the magic of being a creative person. Sometimes we have these thoughts from our characters in our heads, and we know that it's a really important thought or a really, juicy character if they make it out of that kind of, very subconscious kind of like, thinking point into color, into the real world. Um, and so, with that being said, character, as I have right here, right in the middle, of this slide, character is the most important element of fiction. If you remember nothing from the next 10 or so minutes, I want you to remember that, without characters, nothing would happen, right? There literally would not be a story. It would just be nothing, right? It wouldn't be anything. And also, what I have right before that, characters can really stay with us long after we've read or, again, even watched something, right? We can for sure extend this into TV shows and movies as well because it's still writing, it's screenwriting. We connect with the characters. We can see ourselves in them, or we can see our family members or partners or, animals in them, right? So because of that, it's the most important element, but arguably it can teach us the most about society, about our world, about really anything. So whenever we are looking deeper into the characters, we are practicing character analyzation. And I'm sure, we've heard of this terminology before. It's pretty common within, studying and talking about literature. So there's a checklist on page 256 of our ebook that kind of breaks down different ways to analyze characters. So looking way, way ahead, whenever you go to think about, what do I want to write about for this first fiction essay? If you want to talk more about a character or two characters, right, within the stories that we're reading, you can very much so go back to that checklist to kind of get you started. Just again, to offer more ideas. So, traditionally, every story has a protagonist who is the main character, and then an antagonist who's their opponent, right? But as I'm sure we've already, talked about in class, or you've started to kind of recognize, a lot of stories are not as transparent or straightforward as having like a hero and a villain, right? These characters are more complex, they're more nuanced. And really, whatever it is that we're exploring within these characters, it's more so the gray area, like again, I have in your journal entries, maybe you can reflect on why you do or don't like a story. 9 times out of 10, we do or don't like something because of the main character and, how they chose to react or what they said, what they didn't say, right? And so a lot of what we'll be exploring, and maybe what we've already explored, is what makes these characters so complex, so dynamic, and specifically maybe unlikable. So far, you may or may not have come in contact with a character for this class that you didn't like. I promise you, I don't want to, speak this into existence, but if you haven't yet, you probably will down the line. And again, like this is where it's the power of our perspectives, right? I might love a character because like they're so awful, but the same, and in the same vein, you might hate them because they're so awful, right? I mean, I'm sure you notice on this image here, and I apologize for the graininess, it's circa, Google a decade ago. You might recognize some of these fictional, characters. And obviously, the one that is holding my eyes right now is Jack Nicholson in The Shining. I'm forgetting his character's name because I literally always call him Jack Nicholson in The Shining. But, if you've heard of the movie, if you've seen the movie, right? Any version of it really, he is not a nice guy, right? And he's the villain. He's the main character, but he's also the villain, which is really fun. And a lot of people would say, right, unlikable. He literally tries to murder his family. Yes, we can say that he was possessed, but still, try to murder his family. So yeah, give them a shot. They too, the unlikable characters, teach us things along the way. Okay, so this slide is kind of combining a couple of the elements because as we will go on to speak about, obviously these fictional elements are not in a vacuum, right? Whenever we talk about character, we have to talk about plot, right? They literally are one and the same. Like I literally just said about, Jack Nicholson in The Shining, we try, we pretty much don't like him because of what he's doing, right? So they tend to go hand in hand. And so these three types of conflict, again, I'm sure if you haven't maybe like heard of them, you've maybe, well, I know you have seen them within different movies and TV, which is why I like to give these images here just for like maybe some clear examples. Um, so the first type of conflict is man versus man. And then we've got man versus nature and man versus himself. So in terms of man versus man, it's very, clear. We've got Rocky versus Apollo Creed, right? In, I believe, the first Rocky movie. I have not seen them. I know I really should. I'll get on that, I promise. But it's one of the traditional man versus man, one human being going up against another human being, another character, right? Pretty straightforward with that. And then we have man versus nature. So the middle image here is from a movie called, I believe it's called The Impossible, and it was made, I think like 2012-ish. I could be wrong. This is a very young Tom Holland. I'm not sure my mouth. There we go. This is a very young Tom Holland right here. So, and Naomi Watts. So, that's how old it is. But it's about the real life tsunami that hit Thailand right around Christmas Day, I believe. Or maybe I feel like the actual natural disaster happened in 2012 and the movie came out in 2014. I don't know. I could be wrong. But regardless, man versus nature. So we've got, human beings and they're facing a natural disaster or something that can be found, in nature. Animals, the other example would be, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the movie, but Leonardo DiCaprio versus the bear in the movie he won his Oscar for. Begins with an R. Oh, this is gonna bother me. But so it's the very stereotypical nature, right? However, when I talked about this a few years ago, I had students that were like, "Well, what about just like general society as part of nature?" And I thought that was a really unique way of looking at it. And so I wanted to include that, because nature doesn't necessarily have to be like the natural world, right? It can be society and maybe almost like the societal expectations, stereotypes, right? Things that are for one way or another kind of looked at as like quote unquote right versus wrong, right? And obviously when we extend nature into that, we can see a lot more, or we can think of a lot more different examples of conflict, right? And then the final type of conflict is man versus himself. So our last image here is obviously, or maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but Joaquin Phoenix, who played the Joker in Joker, right? If you haven't seen that movie, I'm sure you are familiar with Joker as like the DC villain, right? He's been around for decades. So this movie very carefully and really with a lot of grace talked about the internal conflict that human beings can have, right? We've got mental illness, we've got trauma, we've got bad habits, right? So, really, that internal conflict of somebody not being able to get out of their own way, and that leading to some type of conflict and potentially, if not resolved, downfall. And, for whatever it's worth, if you haven't seen Joaquin Phoenix as Joker, especially in the first movie, he's fantastic. And it really is an amazing depiction of mental health awareness, and what happens when really general society turns its back on the people that arguably need help the most. So yeah, so three types of conflict. And so traditionally, all fictional stories, all characters and plots combined can be traced back to one of them at kind of their brass roots. Okay, so the final slide here, getting back to like fully talking about characters, is kind of echoing what I had said at the end of the narration and point of view PowerPoint. So, whenever we're reading about these fictional characters, there tends to be two ways to go about thinking about them and really analyzing them. So, this one is talking about, how do we view fictional characters versus real life? So, one way to go about that, view number one, is we get to know the characters in these works of fiction, and we try to understand them as we do people that we come across in real life. So, and again, I want you to think about either of these views and maybe which one you might fall into. And really, if you maybe haven't thought about this before, I challenge you to kind of go into the next story that you read, whether it's for this class, for another class, or for yourself. Kind of take a moment to think about, how am I like analyzing the characters in this scene? So for the first of you, again, this is what happens whenever we can see ourselves in the work of fiction. So, if you have personal experience that relates in some way, shape, or form to whatever is being depicted in the fictional work, like we've been saying, you can't help as a human being to put yourself into that person's story. Again, however, it could be the slightest bit of connection. It could be the entire thing, and anywhere in between, right? So you're using your real life experiences to try to figure out, what's going to happen for the fictional characters. So to give you a basic example, let's say that you're reading a story where it's like a child talking to their parents. And I say child and parents, but maybe when I said that, depending on again what age you are and your experiences, you might have seen yourself in just that basic description. So a child talking to their parents. When I said that for myself, I don't know why, but I'm envisioning like myself in my 30s as I am now, talking to my parents that are in their early 60s, right? Maybe when I said that, you took yourself back because I used the word child. And you were 10 years old again, talking to your adult parents, or maybe you were in high school, or maybe you were five, or whatever. Maybe you are the age that you are now, right? And so, without even there being a conflict, child talking to their parents, you probably have some type of image in your head. And you're already thinking about, okay, where am I? What's the conversation about? Is it like, a simple thing like, oh, what are we having for dinner? Is it like, I got in trouble in school and now we have to have a conversation about it? Is it anything else, right? And so we're putting ourselves as human beings from our own experiences into whatever the fictional story is talking about. So that's one way. The other way is really the complete opposite, where we are very much, we can separate and we can recognize that fictional characters are not real people, and they're fully imaginary, right? So we don't try to insert ourselves and our experiences, our family dynamics, our life experiences into these stories. We very much treat them as like almost like a learning lesson. I really like, again, how the book breaks it down. When you view stories like that from very much like I'm reading this story, I'm not involved in it at all. And typically this happens whenever we read a story that we cannot see ourselves in, So especially ones where there's different cultures, different ethnicities, right? Different just interpersonal experiences. So we go into these stories with like, I'm going to learn something that I would not have experienced, elsewhere. And I'm being guided by the writer, right? So again, traditionally, we tend to look at ourselves in terms of our understanding of our characters in either view one or view two. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. It is what it is, right? And then the final thing before I leave you today is, ooh, excuse me, talking about characterization. So that is basically what does the character represent, right? And it can go into symbolism, and obviously we'll talk about that a little bit later on this semester. But pretty much, whenever we go to analyze these characters, kind of going back to the last couple of slides, there's always going to be something, especially again, if the writing is good, obviously, that, this character represents real life people or a set of values or human tendencies and or a demographic group, right? And I want to make sure I say that without associating that with like stereotypes, right? Because that's where the bad writing can come into it. But again, like if you will never be able to understand life from a certain viewpoint. As an example, I'm a female. I will never be able to understand life as a male, right? Whenever I read a story from a male's point of view, I learn something. I learn about, maybe thinking habits or conversations or whatever it is, right? And so, again, going a little bit deeper into the analysis portion, the character, and again, traditionally the main character, they represent one or more things, and that is where the analysis comes in. Um, and so yeah, that is character. Thank you for bearing with me in the couple examples I gave throughout. I will see you in the next one.